January 10th, 1999. Moscow, Idaho. While attending a party at an apartment complex, 25-year-old University of Idaho theater student Wil Hendrick vanishes without explanation, and his abandoned car is soon discovered downtown. 3.5 years later, Wil's skull and jawbone are found in a rural wooded area, and even though his exact cause of death cannot be determined, he is ruled to be the victim of a homicide. Since Wil was gay, it is speculated that he may have been murdered in a hate crime, but even though a number of different theories are explored, there are no conclusive answers about how he died. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to explore a story which I've received numerous requests to cover, and what I also consider to be one of the more underrated cases featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1999 murder of Wil Hendrick. As I'm sure you know, perhaps the most infamous hate crime ever perpetuated on an LGBTQ victim was the murder of 21-year-old University of Wyoming student Matthew Shepard, which took place in October of 1998. So when Wil Hendrick, a gay theater student from the University of Idaho, suddenly went missing during a late-night party only 3 months later, there was some fear that history may have repeated itself. When Wil's story was profiled on Unsolved Mysteries, it marked the first time the show had ever featured a cold case in which they openly mentioned that the victim was gay, and acknowledged that this may have been the reason for his disappearance. At the time the episode originally aired, Wil was technically still a missing person, but 1 year later, his skull and jawbone would be discovered in a rural area. It was confirmed that he was the victim of a homicide, though since the rest of Wil's remains could not be found, the exact circumstances of how he was killed are still unclear. Over the years, investigators have explored a number of different theories, including that Wil was murdered at the party he attended, or fell victim to a disgruntled former employee who had recently been fired from a business run by Wil's partner. While it's certainly possible that Wil was the victim of a hate crime and murdered because of his sexuality, no definitive evidence has ever pointed towards a specific theory, which is why we're going to explore all the different angles on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murder of Wil Hendrick. Our story begins in Idaho in 1999, and our central figure is 25-year-old William Hendrick, who goes by the name Wil. Wil was originally born in Lewiston to parents Keith and Leslie Hendrick and had 3 sisters, and since Leslie was Native American, Wil was a registered member of the Nez Perce tribe. Both of Wil's parents have had long careers in law enforcement, as his father has recently retired as police chief in the small town of Lapwai, while his mother is currently an officer with the Lewiston Police Department. After serving in the Navy following his graduation from high school, Wil decided to attend the University of Idaho in Moscow, where he's majoring in theater and also works a job cleaning buildings on campus. At this particular point, he is about to begin his final semester and hopes to launch an acting career, as he was able to secure a part as an extra in the 1997 Hollywood disaster film Dante's Peak. Wil is also openly gay, and for nearly 5 years, he has been involved in a relationship with his 34-year-old partner, Jerry Schutz, who owns a local shuttle service. The couple currently reside at a trailer court which is owned by Jerry's father, and are planning to exchange vows at a commitment ceremony within the next 4 months. On Saturday, January the 9th, Wil and Jerry spent the majority of the day remodeling their kitchen, and by the time they were finished, Wil wanted to go to a party being hosted by their friend Katie Payne, which was being held to commemorate the end of the holiday break since the new semester was set to commence on Monday. By this point, Jerry was feeling tired and did not want to go to the party, but Wil left in his brown 1984 Pontiac sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight and told Jerry he would be back in a few hours. Katie's party was being held at the 3-story apartment complex where she lived and took place on the 2nd floor. It was attended by members of the university's theater department, but there was actually a second party taking place on the floor above them, which mostly involved former athletes from the town's high school. Shortly after Wil arrived, he would be pulled into some drama with a friend of his named Karen, whose boyfriend was attending the party on the 3rd floor. The couple had gotten into a fight, and since Wil was very protective of Karen, there was concern that he might make a scene by walking upstairs to the other party and confronting the boyfriend. However, even though Wil had gotten very drunk and belligerent, Katie managed to talk him out of getting involved, and Karen eventually left the party. By 2:30 a.m. on the morning of January the 10th, Wil and Katie were hanging out together by the exterior 2nd floor staircase when Katie decided to go back into her apartment to phone Karen and make sure she made it home all right. By the time Katie returned to the staircase, Wil was gone, but since she noticed that his Pontiac was still parked outside, Katie assumed he had gone upstairs to the other party and didn't think much of it. Well, later that morning, sometime after 11:30 a.m., Katie received a phone call from Jerry Schutz, who told her that Wil never came home and wanted to know if he was still at her apartment. By this point, Wil's Pontiac was no longer parked outside, and after Katie told Jerry she had no idea where he was, he tried calling a number of Wil's other friends and fellow students without success. Jerry even tried calling Wil's parents in Lewiston, who also said they had not heard from him. By the morning of Monday, January the 11th, Wil had still not resurfaced, so his friends became concerned enough to start searching Moscow for him. Later that afternoon, Jerry came across Wil's abandoned Pontiac, which was parked in the downtown area near the Moscow Hotel apartments, where Wil had once lived years earlier. The location was about a half-mile south from Katie's apartment complex and a mile away from the trailer court where Wil lived. To Jerry's surprise, the Pontiac was unlocked and the driver and passenger side windows were both rolled down a couple of inches. Wil's work keys from the university were lying on the dashboard, and a portfolio of Wil's artwork and costume designs was in the back seat. The driver's seat was also moved all the way back, which seemed to suggest that someone larger than Wil had been the last person to drive the vehicle. This prompted Jerry to contact the Moscow Police Department to officially report Wil missing, and they would eventually impound the Pontiac for a forensic examination. Since the windows had been left partially rolled down, the cold winter air had seeped into the vehicle and destroyed all possible fingerprints, and there were also no blood or hair samples that belonged to an outside party, or any conclusive evidence that foul play had taken place. However, when the police later returned the car to Jerry, he noticed that the inside wheel wells were encrusted with mud. This made Jerry suspect that an outside party had driven the Pontiac into a rural area, possibly to dispose of Wil's body, and then drove the car back to downtown Moscow in order to abandon it. Investigators would soon learn that shortly after Wil parted ways with Katie at her party, a witness who lived in a basement apartment at the same complex had an encounter with him. According to the witness, he was woken up when Wil drunkenly wandered into his apartment, mumbling and talking tough. He said that he managed to calm Wil down and convinced him to leave without any conflict, which technically made him the last person to see Wil alive. After a search was performed of the basement apartment, the witness was ruled out as having any involvement in Wil's disappearance. While there were no eyewitnesses from the apartment complex who could confirm having seen Wil's Pontiac leave the scene, some witnesses did recall hearing the sound of a car driving away at a high rate of speed sometime during the early morning hours. Since Wil had expressed his desire to visit the party that took place on the 3rd floor that night, there was speculation that a confrontation might have occurred, which led to his death. However, investigators interviewed everyone who was in attendance, and they all passed polygraphs, so no evidence was found to indicate that any of the partygoers were involved in Wil's disappearance. Believe it or not, there were some people who openly expressed their belief that Wil might have abandoned his own car and disappeared voluntarily. When the case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in August of 2001, it featured an interview with a close friend of Wil's named Kathy Sprague, who said that he sometimes felt overwhelmed by school and had talked about abandoning his commitments in order to just take off and tour the country without even telling anyone, including his parents, partner, and friends. However, most people who knew Wil did not believe this was a possibility. On the day his vehicle was found, Wil was supposed to be auditioning for a play which he had spent weeks rehearsing for, and he also failed to pick up a financial aid check for $6,000, which he was planning to use to pay for his final semester. Right from the outset, Jerry had a potential suspect in mind, whom he believed was capable of harming Wil. This man's name has never been released publicly, but he had worked as a van driver for Jerry's shuttle service business. According to Jerry, just over 2 months before Wil's disappearance, this employee started a heated argument with him over repairing one of his headlights. Things escalated to the point where the driver shouted a homophobic slur, which prompted Jerry to immediately fire him. This man resided in the same trailer court where Wil and Jerry lived, and Wil had even crashed at his trailer on a few occasions whenever he was out late drinking and didn't feel like going home and potentially getting into a fight with Jerry. After he was fired from the shuttle service business, the driver got a new job with a long-haul trucking outfit, and sometime between 4:30 and 5 a.m. on January the 10th, approximately 2 hours after Wil was last seen, he traveled to the company's dispatch in Lewiston, located just over 30 miles south of Moscow, and checked out a refrigerated truck. He then proceeded to drive to Florida, which his employer confirmed was related to work business, but what caused concern is that he never actually returned to Moscow, as he apparently phoned a female acquaintance and asked her to move his things out of his trailer. 3 months later, Jerry's father, who owned the trailer court, filed a lawsuit against this man, demanding payment for unpaid rent and property damages he had left behind. Investigators did perform a search of the trailer, but failed to turn up any evidence, and even though the driver was later tracked down in Florida, he refused to cooperate with the authorities. At some point, the Hendrick family was contacted by a psychic who lived in Clarkston and told them she had a vision of Wil being killed by 3 young men wearing Letterman jackets who subsequently disposed of his body, but would later move it to a new location. The family started putting a bit more credence into this story when Wil's mother, Leslie Hendrick, spoke to her nephew's foster brother, who told her he had heard 3 young men brag about killing Wil. When he shared their names with Leslie, she recognized all 3 of them as individuals she had dealt with while working as an officer for the Lewiston Police Department. This made Leslie wonder if they decided to attack Wil because of his connection to her, but even though she turned this information over to investigators, it's unclear how thoroughly they looked into this angle. On July the 1st, 1999, less than 6 months after Wil's disappearance, an horrific hate crime took place in Happy Valley, California, when a gay couple named Gary Mattson and Winfield Mauder were both shot to death in their bed inside their residence. The perpetrators were soon identified as Benjamin Matthew Williams and his brother, James Tyler Williams, who confessed that they murdered the victims because of their sexual orientation. It turned out that Benjamin Matthew Williams was a former student at the University of Idaho who had attended there at the same time as Wil, though he left the area in 1996. Williams became involved in a white supremacy religion known as Christian Identity that denounced homosexuality, and a short time before Wil vanished, Williams had phoned up some acquaintances of his from the Moscow area in hopes of tracking down an old friend named Dan Martin. When one of these people told Williams that Martin had publicly identified himself as gay and was now the coordinator of an HIV prevention group, Williams reportedly became hysterical and started crying. It turned out that Wil Hendrick was acquainted with Dan Martin, and they first became friends when Martin came out as gay in August of 1996. But in spite of this tentative connection, there was no evidence to suggest that Williams ever met Wil or that he was even in Idaho during the time period Wil went missing. Before he could be convicted of the double murder from California, Williams elected to take his own life by slashing parts of his body and bleeding to death in his jail cell in November of 2002. Well, by that point, Wil Hendrick was no longer a missing person. On September the 7th, 2002, over 3.5 years after he originally disappeared, a pair of hunters came across his skull in a rural wooded area of Latah County, located just southeast of Moscow. When the authorities were summoned to the scene, they soon found a jawbone, and it wasn't long before dental records were used to positively identify the remains as belonging to Wil. An extensive search was performed of the surrounding area, but no other skeletal remains could be found. Even though investigators were unable to determine Wil's exact cause of death, he was officially ruled to be the victim of a homicide. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to assist with the investigation, and they came to the conclusion that Wil likely knew his killer, and this person was very familiar with the area. In a 2008 interview with the Lewiston Tribune, Wil's father, Keith Hendrick, stated, quote, "You always say if somebody ever did anything to my kid, I'd kill him. We've all said that. But when the time comes, the hurt is so great, you don't even think about that." End quote. Tragically, Keith passed away in May of 2013 at the age of 75, without receiving any answers about what happened to his son. There have not been any significant developments in the investigation for quite some time, so after more than 23 years, the murder of Wil Hendrick officially remains unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So like I mentioned in the intro, this was the first time that Unsolved Mysteries covered a cold case in which they openly acknowledged that the victim was gay, and Wil Hendrick's story actually got a decent amount of coverage from the mainstream media, as he was also profiled on an episode of a TV show titled Missing Persons, which aired on MSNBC in 2000. I also stated that Wil's disappearance took place only 3 months after the murder of University of Wyoming student Matthew Shepard, who was brutally beaten and tortured by 2 men in a crime so horrific that it eventually led to new legislation, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Since the Shepard murder was national news, I'm sure it was still fresh in many people's minds when Wil went missing, and since he was always very open about his sexuality, there was fear that he also may have been the victim of a hate crime. This was the primary angle that Unsolved Mysteries focused on, but at the time their segment originally aired, Wil was still technically a missing person. Since all that was ever found of Wil were his skull and jawbone, there wasn't enough evidence to determine how he died, so it's still up in the air what the exact motive for his murder might have been. When you're dealing with a situation involving a person going missing from a party while they are heavily intoxicated, I guess you can't completely discount the possibility that the victim wandered off, passed out, and died of exposure. But in this particular case, it's been established that Wil's car was driven away from the party and someone went to the trouble of abandoning it in downtown Moscow, a great distance away from where Wil's remains were found. So even though his exact cause of death could not be determined, investigators felt pretty confident in stating that Wil was the victim of foul play. Even though it would be 3.5 years before Wil was determined to be dead, his friends and family decided to hold a memorial service for him in May of 1999, only 4 months after he vanished. It featured the performance of a play titled The Faces of William, which was written in Wil's honor, and had 4 acts detailing his life, in which his loved ones would appear in front of a microphone and share their memories about him. One of the most poignant stories was shared by Wil's uncle, Caney St. Paul, who admitted that he once had a very negative attitude about gay people and did not hide this from his nephew. But one day, Wil decided to have a one-on-one talk with his uncle about the situation and completely changed his mindset, as Katie now stated that if Wil had lived long enough to marry his partner, Jerry Schutz, he would have been right there to support him. This story also has a tragic parallel to another case I covered on the podcast last month, and that's the 1989 disappearance of Kimberly McAndrew. As you might recall, Kimberly's father had a long career as a sergeant with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and only got to enjoy retirement for a few weeks before his daughter went missing. Well, the same thing essentially happened to Wil's father, Keith Hendrick, as he enjoyed a 38-year career in law enforcement until he retired in 1998. But Keith had to endure the loss of his son a short time later and never got any answers before he passed away. Now, when you go back and watch the Unsolved Mystery segment, one of the potential angles they seem to focus on is that something bad might have happened to Wil at the party he attended and his death was covered up. On the surface, that scenario might seem plausible, as Wil was at a get-together for artsy theater students while a second party involving former high school jocks was taking place on the floor above them. Wil was known for becoming very belligerent whenever he was drunk, and if anyone ever used a homophobic slur in his presence, he would definitely react to it. Since Wil's friend Karen was having issues with her boyfriend, and Wil had to be talked out of going to the other party to confront him, you can see how this might have escalated into a situation which went horribly wrong. However, investigators did confirm that everyone from that party was questioned and polygraphed, and no one gave off any indication that they might be hiding something about Wil's disappearance. Indeed, I think that if an incident took place there, Wil's friend, Katie Payne, would have heard it from downstairs, and it would be very difficult for all those people to stay silent for 2 decades if something happened, which led to Wil being killed and his body dumped somewhere. As you recall, Katie last saw Wil on the outside stairwell before he disappeared, but since his car was still parked outside, she assumed he had gone upstairs to the other party. However, the one key detail the Unsolved Mysteries segment does not mention is that a tenant from a basement apartment reported that Wil drunkenly wandered inside his residence before he made him leave. I have a feeling that this is probably where Wil was when he parted ways with Katie and she noticed his car. There were also reports from eyewitnesses who recalled hearing the sound of a car speeding away from the scene during the early morning hours, though we can't be 100% certain if this was Wil's Pontiac. I guess you can't rule out the possibility that a third party abducted or harmed Wil before fleeing the scene in his vehicle, but I'm inclined to believe that he drove away from the party of his own accord. But the big mystery is, what happened to him afterward? While the downtown location where Wil's car was found was in the opposite direction of his residence, so there doesn't seem to be any real reason for him to have driven there himself. But since the Pontiac was unlocked, the driver's seat was moved all the way back, and some of Wil's most important possessions were left inside, I think it's safe to assume that someone else parked the car there. The authorities have always publicly withheld the exact location where Wil's remains were found, only that it was in a rural area southeast of Moscow, but since the Pontiac's inside wheel wells were encrusted with mud, it's likely that someone used Wil's own vehicle to dispose of his body before driving it back to Moscow and abandoning it. But where did Wil originally cross paths with his killer? I'm not sure if Wil was the type of person who would stop and offer a ride to a stranger, but he lived only about a half-mile from the apartment complex, so what are the odds of him bumping into a random predator in the middle of the night before he arrived home? I know one person who was looked at as a possible suspect was Benjamin Matthew Williams, because he was a former University of Idaho student who went on to commit a hate crime by murdering a gay couple in California 6 months after Wil disappeared. Even though Williams had moved out of the area years earlier, the main link he had to Wil is that they were both mutual friends with another local resident named Dan Martin. When Williams was charged with double murder, Martin was very open about discussing his past relationship with him. They had become best friends while members of a charismatic Christian church called Living Faith Fellowship, and while Martin claimed he was never sexually involved with Williams, he described their relationship as a quote-unquote romantic friendship, where they would participate in such activities as exchanging poetry and skinny dipping together. It seems like the two men took opposite paths, as Martin eventually came out as gay and became an activist, whereas Williams seemed to be filled with self-loathing and embraced white supremacy. Since Williams reportedly learned about Martin coming out of the closet a short time before went missing and seemed to suffer an emotional meltdown about the situation, I could see a scenario unfolding where Williams decided to unleash his rage on another gay person and Wil was the unfortunate victim. But investigators found nothing to indicate that Williams even knew who Wil Hendrick was or that they were mutual friends with Dan Martin, and they couldn't even place Williams in the Moscow area in January of 1999. So I'm inclined to think the Martin connection is nothing more than a coincidence, and that Wil fell prey to someone else. However, before we start talking more about the homophobia, we have to explore the alternate theory that Wil was not murdered because of his sexuality, but because his mother, Leslie Hendrick, was involved in law enforcement. There are not too many details about this angle, only that the foster brother of Leslie's nephew told her he heard three men brag about killing Wil. Since each of these guys had crossed paths with Leslie while she was a police officer, she wondered if they might have decided to confront Wil because of who his mother was. All we know is that Leslie passed this information on to the authorities, but it's unclear if they did anything with it. The only reporting I've seen on this angle was in a February 2001 edition of the University of Idaho student newspaper, The Argonaut, and Wil's remains had not yet been found at this point. I know that the Moscow Police Department faced some criticism because they did not take Wil's disappearance seriously enough at first, as they apparently believed he had just run off somewhere and would resurface, which is why they did not actually impound Wil's abandoned car and do a forensic examination until 3 days after it was found. In addition, during the first few days Wil was missing, his friends and family were the ones who took the initiative to organize search efforts for him, and the police did not even participate. But as time went on, the authorities seemed to take the case a lot more seriously and formed the Wil Hendrick Homicide Investigation Task Force, which included the participation of the Moscow Police Department, the Idaho State Police, the Lewiston Police Department, the Latah County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI. I'm going to talk more about this momentarily, but it seems like some of these agencies had a more vested interest in the case than others, though I'd like to think they did their due diligence when exploring this angle about the three men who allegedly bragged about killing Wil. My big issue with this theory is that Lewiston is located over 30 miles away from Moscow, so I'm not sure these guys would have even known who Leslie Hendrick's son was, let alone been compelled to drive to another town in order to attack him. But since Wil's disappearance was pretty big news in the area, I wonder if they were just overheard running their mouths about him because of some vendetta against his mother, even though they had no actual involvement in the crime. Overall, I definitely think the most promising lead in this case involves the unnamed truck driver who lived in Wil's trailer court. Now, because his identity has never been made public, we don't know all that many details about this man, but what we do know really makes him sound like a fairly promising suspect. As you recall, Wil's partner Jerry fired the driver from his job at his shuttle service business for using a homophobic slur against him. I'm sure it's tempting to believe that the driver harmed Wil to get revenge on Jerry for firing him, but this was over 2 months after the fact, and he'd already gotten another job as a long-haul truck driver. Since they all lived in the same trailer court, the guy would have had ample opportunity to get retribution if he was still holding a grudge against Jerry. I find it very interesting that Wil had crashed at the driver's trailer on previous occasions if he had been out late at night drinking. The story goes that if Wil felt that Jerry was going to start a fight with him when he returned home, he would avoid the situation by staying with his neighbor. Even though Jerry ultimately decided not to go to Katie's party, I've never seen anything to indicate that he and Wil were fighting before he left, but we know that Wil did get pretty drunk, so perhaps he went over to the truck driver's trailer in order to crash for the night, and that's when something went horribly wrong. Granted, even though it sounds like Wil and the driver had been on cordial terms before, I have a feeling that things would have been tense between them after he was fired, particularly since Wil had no qualms about confronting people who used homophobic slurs. Since Wil was known for becoming belligerent whenever he was intoxicated and had to be talked out of a potential confrontation at Katie's party, perhaps after he left and drove back to the trailer court, he felt a sudden urge to start something with his neighbor. Or perhaps Wil and this guy just happened to cross paths there and things escalated into violence. Hypothetically, if he killed Wil at the trailer court, the driver could have placed Wil's body inside his Pontiac and used it to drive to the rural wooded area outside of town in order to dispose of him. He then drives the vehicle into downtown Moscow in order to abandon it, and since the location is only about a mile south of the trailer court, it would not have been much of an issue for him to walk back home. It's also worth noting that the Pontiac was found outside the Moscow Hotel apartments where Wil had previously lived years earlier. It's possible that's nothing more than a coincidence, but perhaps someone with personal knowledge of Wil's history chose that spot for a reason. But before we state with any certainty that this guy was the killer, we have to address a big issue involving the timeline. We know that the driver went to his truck dispatch in Lewiston in order to pick up a refrigerated truck sometime between 4:30 and 5 a.m. that morning, which on the surface sounds pretty ominous, since it gives off the impression he might have been using it to store or transport Wil's body. It's also been reported that the driver then took the truck down to Florida on work business, but then never came back, and asked an acquaintance to move his stuff out of his trailer, which seems to indicate that he needed to leave town in a big hurry. Well, the problem is that even though this detail about the refrigerated truck might have seemed suspicious while Wil was still a missing person, we know that his remains were ultimately found just outside of Moscow. The last time Wil was confirmed to be alive was at the apartment complex sometime around 2:30 a.m., so if this trucker was the killer, he would have only had between 2 to 2.5 hours to murder Wil, dump his body in the wooded area, abandon the Pontiac in downtown Moscow, and then travel 30 miles to Lewiston to pick up the truck. That really seems like a pretty narrow window of time. But on the other hand, it still looks awfully suspicious that this guy immediately decided to relocate to Florida without any notice, and then refused to cooperate with the authorities when they attempted to question him. I know a search of his trailer failed to turn up any evidence, and Jerry's father later filed a lawsuit against him for unpaid rent, so perhaps the guy just decided to skip town in order to avoid paying his debts. But if so, it seems like one hell of a coincidence that he would leave during the exact same time period when Wil happened to go missing. Well, before we talk any more about the truck driver, I need to discuss another odd complication in this case. I mentioned earlier that a Wil Hendrick homicide investigation task force was formed, and one of the investigative agencies was the Latah County Sheriff's Office. There was one detective from the Sheriff's Office named Wayne Roush who attempted to work on this case, but claimed that he kept facing interference from the Latah County Sheriff, Jeff Crouch. Not only did Crouch pull Roush off the investigation, but he went so far as to put password protection on the case file, which meant that Roush could not even access his own reports. It was not until Roush himself was elected Latah County Sheriff in 2004 that he could finally get his hands on the file and start working the case again. But he said that he was, quote-unquote, absolutely stunned at the lack of follow-up on most of the leads. So could this mean that Sheriff Crouch was attempting to stonewall the investigation and protect Wil's killer? Well, since the identity of the truck driver has never been released publicly, I have no idea if he had any sort of relationship with the sheriff, or if Crouch would have had any motivation to cover for him. But the other potential explanation might simply be that Crouch was homophobic and did not want his office spending any time and resources investigating the disappearance of a gay man. If true, that's still pretty despicable behavior, but at least it was not an intentional attempt to protect the perpetrator. Regardless, I cannot think of any logical reason to password protect the case file and prevent your lead detective from accessing it when you're not actually doing any investigative work on it yourself. When searching through the newspaper archives, I found a few articles from March of 1999 when Wayne Roush announced the sheriff's office had identified a person of interest in Wil's disappearance, stating, quote, "I have some real suspicions and some direction to go in. I'm optimistic that we may be able to eventually come up with something," end quote. While I initially assumed that this person of interest was the truck driver, but these articles also stated that the individual was not an acquaintance of Wil's, which would seem to rule out the driver since Wil had flat out crashed at his trailer. I have to assume that this might have been one of the leads Roush was exploring before Sheriff Crouch pulled him off the case, but who could this person of interest have been? Well, on May the 4th, 2022, while I was working on my script for this episode, Northwest Public Broadcasting produced an all-new news segment about this case, which featured current interviews with Jerry Schutz and Wayne Roush, who has since retired as Latah County Sheriff. Even though Jerry still thinks that the truck driver was the best suspect, Roush mentioned that he investigated another potential suspect whom he personally believes was responsible for Wil's death. This individual was an unnamed hitchhiker whom the truck driver had picked up in Texas. Apparently, the hitchhiker had been fired from his job at an old folks' home because he hated gays, so Rausch thinks that he may have gotten into an altercation with Wil and wound up killing him. Rausch then stated, quote, "What I can prove in court and what I honestly believe in my heart of hearts are obviously two different things," end quote. Needless to say, this recent news segment was a revelation because it's the first time I've ever heard of this hitchhiker, and it's left me with so many unanswered questions. I'm assuming that the hitchhiker was in Moscow on the night Wil disappeared and may have been staying at the trailer court with the truck driver. If that's the case, then perhaps Wil and the hitchhiker crossed paths after he returned from the party and things escalated into violence. Perhaps the truck driver was not directly responsible for Wil's death, but may have been present or involved in the cover-up, which would explain why he immediately left for Florida and did not return. The hitchhiker may have been the person who disposed of Wil's body and abandoned his Pontiac while the driver was picking up his truck in Lewiston. It's not clear to me if the hitchhiker was still in Moscow by the time a missing persons investigation was launched, or if Rausch or anyone else got the opportunity to personally interview him, but I'm guessing that he was the person of interest that Rausch was referring to in those articles from March of 1999, since he wouldn't have been acquainted with Wil. But unfortunately, it's possible that Rausch did not get to pursue this angle as far as he could have because his boss pulled him off the case. This revelation about the hitchhiker was a big surprise to me, and while I consider this to be a very intriguing theory, I can't really speculate too much since there's no further information available about him. And I also have no idea what the current whereabouts of the hitchhiker or of the truck driver might be today. But it was very sad to watch Jerry Schutz get interviewed in this recent news segment, as he referred to Wil as the quote-unquote light of his life, and he is clearly still devastated by the loss of his former partner. Wil obviously left behind a strong legacy and a number of people who loved him, and regardless of whether or not he was the victim of a hate crime or his sexuality played any role in his murder, his loved ones deserved to receive conclusive answers. After all these years, I'm not sure if there's much in the way of physical evidence to help solve this case, so it might take the right person to come forward in order to achieve a resolution. So if you happen to have any information on the unsolved murder of Wil Hendrick, please contact the Moscow Police Department at 208-882-2677. That's 208-882-2677. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. This past month, I released a bonus episode about a famous case from Unsolved Mysteries where a woman named Stephanie Booker had her face slashed by a propeller in a hit-and-run incident involving a speedboat, and the perpetrators were never identified. In addition, we've dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover another classic case from Unsolved Mysteries, the unexplained 1989 death of Russell Evans. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Vincent G., Jordan F., Meredith M., and Peyton T. Thank you all so much for your support. Now, the reminder that in just a few weeks, I'm going to be appearing at CrimeCon UK, which is being held at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London on June the 11th and 12th. If you would like to get a 10% discount on tickets to this event, please visit crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COLD22. Once again, that's crimecon.co.uk and the promo code is COLD22. And I've got one more special announcement. Later this summer, The Trail Went Cold is also going to be appearing at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place at the Weston Park Central Hotel in Dallas, Texas, from August the 27th to 28th. Myself and many other prominent true crime podcasts will be in attendance, and there will be a bunch of panel sessions, discussions, and live episodes. So in order to purchase tickets, please visit the website truecrimepodcastfestival.com. That's truecrimepodcastfestival.com. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.
Bye.